Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today, we will be talking about empathy and leadership and the space in between. And I'm delighted to welcome Maria Ross, author of The Empathy Dilemma. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Maria, you've just written The Empathy Dilemma, but you've also authored several other books on this topic. I can see them behind you, The Empathy Edge, as well as The Empathy Dilemma. And I don't think you thought you would have to write another book on empathy, but we'll come to that. Thank you, COVID. But I know you work constantly with leaders across the globe and you run your own podcast as well called The Empathy Edge, with a view to, and this is a quest we share, operationalizing learning and having more impact on this topic in organizations. But it's super important for today's leaders, I think, to understand what this means for them. So can we start there, Maria? What is empathy for you and what is it not?
Yeah, I love this question because I think the misunderstandings and the false narratives are what get in the
Yeah,
way of
yeah.
us really adopting empathy at work. And
Mm,
it's not only, a humane thing, but it's actually a business benefit to embrace
absolutely.
empathy at
Mm,
work. When
mm,
I did my research on the first book, all of the vectors that empathetic cultures and leaders impact, increased engagement, innovation, retention, customer loyalty, and customer revenue. So there are real bottom line benefits to this.
mm.
And that's why I love talking about this with folks like you from a practical standpoint.
Yeah.
But when I was researching my first book years ago, there were lots of different definitions of empathy out there. And we
Mm,
spoke earlier, about even cross-cultural differences
yeah.
in what we mean by
Huge.
empathy.
Mm,
But the definition of empathy has changed over time as well. In the 1700s, it meant something very different than it means
mm,
today.
mm,
So for the purpose of really understanding how we can embrace it at work, I use this definition in my work, and it's very accessible to people. Empathy is the ability to see, understand, and where appropriate, feel another person's perspective, and then further use that information to act with compassion. So,
mm.
compassion is really empathy in action. But there's a couple things to break down there. One is you don't always have to feel. You can
Yeah.
you can use cognitive empathy to
Mm,
imagine what someone is thinking or think about what questions they might have or what information they might want.
mm,
That's a form of embracing empathy with your brain, with your
mm.
head. So for folks that are a little uncomfortable with the squishy part of it, I love to say it doesn't mean crying on the floor with your employees.
Yes.
Now, it can lead to emotional empathy, which is the other side of empathy, which is yes, I'm connecting with the emotions you have.
Mm,
You're anxious, you're angry, my heartbeat starts to go up, my palms start to sweat. I really feel what you're feeling.
mm,
But you don't have to access empathy solely from the emotional part. It can actually be accessed for people that are analytical or left brain thinkers. It
mm,
can be accessed from the cognitive point of view too. And that just means taking a pause, taking a beat. So in summary, if you think of empathy as a method of information gathering, I'm
mm,
trying to understand your point of view, your context, and then I'll be able to move forward with you and I can
mm,
take a next right step, whether that next right step is a compromise, whether that next right step is just listening and giving you a chance to vent,
mm,
whether that next right step is to figure out, maybe we need to find a different role for you. Maybe the next right step is we need to level up your skill set in this particular area. But until I get all the information like a good detective, I can't figure out what that is. So
mm.
I like where folks are kind of uncomfortable with the idea of empathy at work, think of it as information gathering.
I love that. I love the idea of information gathering. I also love the idea of using it, feeling when it's appropriate.
Hmm.
Partly because everybody has their own model, partly because, as you said before, there's a large cultural context and element to this, and it's situational, isn't it? As is
Hmm.
leadership. So, and I think you've just mentioned loads of different ways that empathy can be shown, demonstrated, and often we're more at ease with cognitive because that's where we spend most of our time. But
Hmm.
I often find like with inclusion, which when I talk about inclusion, which is a little bit like empathy because it can remain fluffy,
Yeah.
and leaders think it's about being nice or
Yes.
agreeing with
Oh,
everyone. And I spend a lot of my time busting these myths because it is a bottom line subject, as
yes.
is empathy in terms of what it brings to people, what it
Hmm.
brings to the workplace, and therefore what it brings to business. So um, I know there's myths around empathy, and there are
Hmm.
four specific ones in your book. And one of those is the same myth that surrounds empathy or even shrouds empathy, I think, in terms of, oh, it's just about being nice. It's about saying yes to
Hmm.
everyone. So
Hmm.
can you tell us a little bit more about those common misconceptions and the effects that it therefore has on leaders and teams when that happens?
Yeah, I love this because I think there's a lot of directives that are given around how to
Yeah,
embrace empathy to achieve all the benefits I spoke about, and
yeah,
probably the same with inclusion.
yeah,
But when you, and I hate to say it so concretely, but when you kind of do empathy wrong, it can go astray.
oh
And then
yeah,
then you say, "Oh, I'm
totally.
not getting all the benefits of it that you said, and my leaders are burning out." And well, that's because empathy is not about being nice, as you've
No.
said. You can be nice, but that's really more about what you think is nice for the
Mm,
person or what makes you feel good to do for a
mm,
person. It's not understanding their point of view and seeing the situation or feeling what they feel from their point of view.
mm,
It's also not about caving into unreasonable demands. So, a lot of the times, what happens is leaders, in the name of empathy, burn out because they're doing everything for their team. They're bending over backwards, they're accommodating, and that is people pleasing. That is
yeah.
submission. That's not empathy. I can be empathetic and understand where you are and how you're feeling and what you're thinking, but I can still make difficult business decisions at the same time. But I
Yeah.
can support you through it in an empathetic way.
Yeah.
And empathy is also not about agreeing with someone, which is so
Mm.
important in our times today. You can
So
have an
important.
empathetic
Mm.
conversation, and I can try to understand, Susie, your point of view about a budget issue or a
Yeah.
strategic decision. And I don't have to walk away converted. Empathy is about connection, not conversion. But if
Mm.
I understand where you're coming from, I can say, okay, I still don't see it that way. I still don't agree, but I understand better what you're thinking, what your goals are, where you're going. So maybe we modify in this way. Or maybe
Yeah.
I can talk to you to your concerns and say,
Mm.
actually, the strategic direction I want to take, um, addresses those concerns.
Mm.
And here's how.
Mm.
So I don't have to walk away agreeing with you. We can have an empathetic conversation. And you don't always have to leave it with kind of the passive aggressive, well, let's agree to disagree,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Because that
exactly.
can be a little passive aggressive. But but just knowing that I don't have to bend to your will in order to show empathy, I think is really important for us
Mm.
to know.
And the empathy can really leverage, can't it, healthy challenge in the same way that psychological safety can. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of people tick a box and say, "Oh, I've done empathy. I've said yes," or "I've done empathy. I've asked him or her how she is today." And I think that
Yes.
I see this a lot also with inclusion, and empathy is the same. If it goes wrong, they get a little scared of stepping back into that
Hmm.
arena,
Hmm.
cognitively and emotionally, of
Yeah.
how do
Yeah.
I do this? It says on my list of leadership stuff that I'm meant to be empathetic. I said yes, or I gave in and now I'm burnt out. And it's just
Hmm.
interesting to see how that cycle happens,
Hmm.
Maria. How do you see people, two things? One, noticing that. And
Hmm.
once I've noticed it, which is where the work starts, what can I do?
Yeah, I mean, this is why, you were saying earlier, I've written two books now on
Yeah,
empathy. And the first book, The Empathy Edge, was the business case for empathy for the
yeah,
skeptics. It was the ROI. Here's all
yeah,
the data, here's all the
yeah,
research curated on how it makes you a better leader, have a stronger culture, and a stronger brand. This book was written for those people, kind of the ones you're talking about, where they're like, okay, I get it. I'm embracing human-centered leadership.
And now what?
And here's where I'm struggling, right?
Yeah.
So, the 5 pillars of effective and empathetic leadership that I outline in the book, the
Mm,
first one is self awareness, because you cannot go into the world with empathy if your own house is not in order.
no.
So, you need to know what your strengths are. What do you bring to the interaction? What are your challenges or your blind spots? What are your emotional triggers? That's a huge one for
Yeah.
leaders because
Yeah.
we react blindly because of our emotional triggers. And that's where you can start to get a sense of, oh, I'm seeing this pattern now in interactions and relationships that have gone right and that have gone wrong.
Mm,
And now that I'm aware of them, I can be on the lookout for them. So just to give you an example, a CEO that I spoke to many C-suite leaders in
mm,
researching this book for my podcast. One C-suite leader, her story really stands out for me because she's a CEO, and she, after doing really great self-assessment, really great professional development, on, adopting a growth mindset and saying, it doesn't matter that I'm CEO, there's still more to learn. There's still more I can improve
Mm,
on.
mm,
She realized that one of her emotional triggers is not being believed. And how that shows up for her is when she gets the email that says, well, you said this, or
yeah.
you promised us this deliverable by this time. She would automatically go into panic mode and, like many of us,
Mm,
start going back through all her sent emails,
yeah.
right? I know I didn't say that. I know I didn't say
I'm sure I
that.
said this.
I'm sure I said this. And so she would meet that with defensiveness and fear.
Mm, mm,
And when you don't have your own house in order,
uh,
you cannot see another person's
yep.
perspective without defensiveness and fear. So
Mm,
once she realized this was an emotional trigger for her, she developed ways to like understand the words or the script that people would use
mm,
to say that, and to know if she read it in an email or heard it in a talk, to take a beat, to take a step back, and to say, well, tell me what you think you heard. Tell me what you think our agreement was, and to
mm,
actually get the information from them, and then be able to correct them if they
mm,
were wrong, or
mm,
admit to it if she was right. But because if she hadn't done the work on the
yeah.
self-awareness and understanding, she never would have guessed that that was an emotional trigger for her.
No.
So it was by reflecting on negative interactions and reflecting on positive interactions and
Mm,
doing the work that she was able to recognize that as a negative pattern that was impacting her effectiveness.
and I love that because everybody has these patterns, and unless we intentionally look and notice what we notice, I like to say about our patterns,
Mm-hmm.
we don't know. It really reminds me of learning a second language. You have to intention at the beginning. You have to
Mm-hmm.
intentionally understand how the grammar's put together, understand the patterns, think about what you want to say, translate it appropriately. And I think that distance that you have is
Mm-hmm.
really important to make sure that you're going to either show up in the way you want to or
Mm-hmm.
say what you would like to, which brings me to your second foundational pillar, which is self-care. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think all that can take an incredible amount of self-mastery, but also energy and
Mm-hmm.
resource. And it was a light bulb moment for me reading your book when you made a differentiation between self-care and self-maintenance. Okay. So like going for a manicure or something is self-maintenance. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have been
Yeah.
kidding myself for a very long time that I'm doing self-care. Um, but maybe I'm not really resourcing myself, and that it's
Mm-hmm.
actually self-maintenance. I would love it if you could walk our
Mm-hmm.
listeners through that a little bit, because I think we can get stuck in our own beliefs and myths about
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing to sort of, even if we're aware what we're doing to resource ourselves, which we may not be having compassion for ourselves. We may not be having empathy and action for ourselves, particularly women leaders.
For sure, we might be putting a band-aid over it. And I want to give
Yeah.
full credit to that concept to a women's coach named Jamie Greenwood,
Mm,
who's someone I have worked with a lot in the past. And she is the one that sort of had that light bulb moment for me, as I
yeah.
mentioned in the book, around that it is, there's a lot of things we do in the name of replenishing our tank. As
Yeah.
you said, I love how you said it, resourcing ourselves.
Yeah.
Uh, but kind of what I said earlier, if you're not at full capacity when you show up in the interaction, you're going to show up with defensiveness and fear. Because if
Yeah.
you've got all your stuff going on in your head, and if you're, think about when you're tired and hungry, you're not the best parent, you're not the
No.
best colleague, you're not the best anything, right? And it's the same thing emotionally and spiritually and psychologically. So when we talk about self-care, it's more about what refills your tank, what recharges you, what gets your brain looking at situations in a different way.
Mm.
For me in the past, when I have time, it's been engaging in community theater and
Yeah.
independent film. And that is just, it's a completely different world for me. And it
Mm.
enables me to disengage from the rat race, from the wheel, and think and approach things in a completely different way. That actually recharges me, however exhausting it is.
Mm.
For some people, it is things like yoga and meditation and things that are more restful. But for others, it can be something very active, like
Yeah.
rock climbing or
Yeah.
training for a marathon.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we really don't know what our self-care can or could be unless we do that self-awareness
Mm.
first and
Mm.
realize what is it that recharges me, that replenishes me,
Yeah.
that gets me, maybe it's a walk in nature.
Yeah.
All of these things are ways that we replenish our body and our soul. For some people, it's knitting. For some people, it's prayer.
Mm,
Finding that practice that you can go to say, okay, I'm settled, I'm grounded, I'm mindful, and now I'm able to show up in a conversation without perceiving it as a personal attack.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I played the cello in an orchestra. I've played the cello for a very
Oh,
long time, and that's my self-care as well.
music's
Although,
amazing.
yeah, it
Yeah,
is amazing and it takes you elsewhere. It's fabulous, but I hadn't put a self-care label on it. It's really interesting,
it
Maria. I
is.
hadn't. Walking in nature, yes. Doing Pilates and yoga, yes. Going for
Mm-hmm.
massage, yes. But now I'm asking myself questions about the massage. Am I doing a self-care tick? Self-care tick. Maybe it's not resourcing me as
I
much
mean,
as
that could still be
oh,
self-care.
of course.
Physically, right?
Yes, of
Physically, that
course.
could be self-care. Yeah.
But that expanded my thought on what self-care
Mm-hmm.
means, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore also on where I put my boundaries. So when do I say no to orchestra? When do I say yes to orchestra? And why? And am I keeping the promise I made to myself of better work-life balance and spending more time with my son and other things? And
Mm-hmm.
the empathy dilemma centers on the idea of balance. It was a big message for me. And the
Mm-hmm.
rest of the title, isn't it? It's how successful leaders balance performance, people, and personal boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about balance, the subject of balance, and why is it pivotal to empathy and the use of empathy in the workplace?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm just going to go on a little side rant for a second. And I'm sure I feel like you're going to agree with me on this. This whole idea of work-life balance is a little bit of a myth. I like to
Yes,
talk about it as work-life integration because
absolutely.
otherwise I always think of it this way of like, then that means I'm giving 11.5% to everything in my life, right?
Yeah.
But it's different seasons. I
Mm,
look at it almost like a mixing board, an audio
mm,
mixing board. Sometimes some of the levels need to go up and other levels need to go down. And other times the
yeah.
reverse is true. And so I think this idea of balance is more about my ultimate philosophy is that we have many of us have given into this false narrative that it's either or leadership,
Yes.
right? I
Yeah.
can be either empathetic or high performing. I can be either empathetic and compassionate or meet my goals.
Yeah.
Or be, there was even, I mentioned in the book headlines out
Yeah.
there like, is empathy out and efficiency is in? It's like, no, it's both and. And the more that we can balance both of those things to be true at the same time, we open up our thinking, we expand our aperture
Mm,
on what is possible in the workplace, that it
mm,
doesn't always have to be heartless and cold in order to be efficient and high performing, that we can be compassionate and warm and inclusive and still crush our goals,
yeah. Yeah.
So it's really all about creating that balance, but not even just so much the balance, but more of the like, let's hold both of these things to be true at the same time
Yeah.
and see what happens when we approach our work from that mindset.
Mm. And I think, the work-life balance discussion, I completely agree with you. The balance part is binary. It's work
Hmm.
or home. In the same way as the leadership myths around I can't take a decision and be empathetic. I can't be high performing and be vulnerable. I can't be
Yeah.
all these things, which just for me underlines the binary nature of the way we think and the way we run our workplaces, and therefore the narratives within those workplaces and society. But let's stay in the workplace.
Yeah.
And it brings me to the third and fourth pillar of your model, which clarity and decisiveness.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember looking at it thinking decisiveness. Oh yeah, empathy and decisiveness, and it
Hmm.
just made me think. And what you tell us that clarity paves the way for empathy. Can you tell
Hmm.
us a little bit more about this? Is what is seemingly a dichotomy between
Hmm.
clarity and empathy and decisiveness and empathy, but in fact they're
Yeah.
very complementary.
Yeah, and this is great because there's the reason that people don't usually equate clarity and decisiveness with empathy is because of the misperception
Yeah.
of the pendulum swinging too far the other way, right?
Mm.
So when we talk about clarity, it's about the most unempathetic thing you can do with a team is to leave them in limbo,
Yeah. Yeah.
is to have them face every day not sure what their objectives are, not sure what mission they're driving towards, not sure how they should be performing their work or what's expected of them or how they're going to advance. None of that is conducive to them doing their best work and
Mm.
ultimately impacting productivity and performance. Because if they're being held back by fear and uncertainty, your brain literally cannot operate effectively. Your executive skills cannot
Yeah.
operate effectively under anxiety and fear.
Mm.
It shuts down. Your cognitive functions shut down. So I always like to think, is that really what a leader wants? Is a team of 20 people who are not at their cognitive
Yeah.
optimum in the workplace? I don't think anybody
No.
wants that. So clarity is really about, again, taking the perspective of the other person. What would they want to know in
Mm.
order for them to do their best work? And maybe maybe as a leader, you sit at the beginning of every week, 10 or 15 minutes, asking yourself that question. What does my team need to know and understand this week? If I'm them, what do
Mm.
I want to know?
Mm.
And that can be anything from setting norms of the culture and actually not just pretty posters on the wall that have bullet points of values, but
Mm.
what do those values actually mean in action? Give examples of the behaviors and the traits that you seek so people
Mm.
can have a better understanding of what you mean by integrity. What do
Mm.
you mean by customer focused?
Yeah.
What do you mean by collaborative? Like the bullets on the wall just kill me. But also going beyond the job description of
Yeah.
how does work get done here. So if there are unwritten rules that
Which there
your
always
culture
are.
has, yeah, they shouldn't be unwritten. They
Hmm.
should be written, they should be discussed, they should be articulated. Because there's nothing worse than coming into a situation and not knowing that's a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
because then you're constantly like, oh, looking over my shoulder, like, did I screw this up? Did I mess this up? So we're talking about clarity, meaning really being crystal clear and not making assumptions, especially when we have so many generations in the workplace
Yeah.
with different definitions of
Yeah.
things like information, communication, work ethic, responsibility.
Mm.
So let's be really clear with each other. It doesn't make any sense to say, I thought everyone knew that.
Mm.
Or, well, that's a given. If you're
Mm.
saying phrases like that within your culture, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And so, as you saw in the book, one of the companies I highlighted does a memorandum of understanding that
Yeah.
everyone signs. That's more about how they're going to work together, not job descriptions.
No.
And that could be anything from, in your culture, how you run meetings, how you run brainstorming sessions,
Mm.
how you conduct one-to-ones or how you give or get feedback. Those are all, again, unwritten rules. We assume everybody knows how to do them. But
Mm.
wouldn't it be great if we, spelled out for people, um, as an example, the example that I used in the book, one of the norms of their culture was to, if you have an idea,
Mm.
it's always about making that idea better. So it's about adding to it and maybe
Mm.
even playing devil's advocate against it. That's
Mm.
actually a norm in their culture. You need to explain that to someone before they go
Absolutely.
into a meeting and throw an idea out there and all of a sudden feel like they're getting attacked.
Mm.
So clarity really just helps us know the road we're on, know where we stand, know why we're here, and just being really clear with that. Now, that doesn't mean that clarity, especially when it comes to feedback, really
Yeah.
giving useful, constructive feedback. This is not a license. This whole,
No.
the idea of radical candor is great until you realize you actually need it to be kind candor.
Yes.
You need it to be, just
Mm.
because you're saying something, you can't, it's not appropriate to say something in a way that's going to hurt someone's feelings or have a negative impact just in
Mm.
the name of being honest.
Yeah.
We do have to couch ourselves and, again, understand their point of view, give specific feedback,
Mm.
but give it in a way that's constructive and helpful and supportive.
Mm. We're back to the empathy thing, aren't we? If I come back to your last example of what would they
Mm-hmm.
like clarity on, if I'm giving you feedback, it's who do I have in front of me?
Mm-hmm.
What do I know about this person? How are they going to react to this subject? And therefore, how am I going to give them this clear feedback in a way that they will not feel threatened or
Right.
offended or and I think the distance needed to have that thought process before you do things in today's busy work environment is often just forgotten, isn't it? And I
Mm-hmm.
like the idea around giving permission explicitly for what's obvious for me about
Mm-hmm.
how we work in this area. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it can be as simple as that, can't it? Just giving
Mm-hmm.
permission explicitly for this is how we work in this team.
Mm-hmm.
We do this. Ideas are welcome. You can do this. We do this on a Monday morning. Is that okay
Yeah.
for you? Now,
Right. And then they know what
yeah,
they're signing up for. And also
exactly.
if the performance deviates from that, you've got something to point to. Now
Yeah.
you can have a conversation that's not like you're doing all these things wrong, but like help me understand what part of this was not clear to you. Help me understand why, we have decided as a team and as a culture, this is how we're going to operate.
Mm,
You seem to be bristling against this. Like tell me what's going on for you.
mm,
And now I have something to point to that's
mm,
that's not subjective.
mm. I think particularly for multicultural teams where everyone comes in with their own
Yes.
assumptions, their own lenses, their own definitions, like you said before, of hierarchy, power, time, ways of working. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
minefield, isn't it,
Yeah.
in terms of what could go wrong and also what could go right. But you need a big
Hmm.
dose of empathy in there, don't you?
Yeah.
When do you think leaders have to dial back on their empathy?
So there are certain situations where it you might have to dial it back. I'm also of the mind that empathy always has a place when we're interacting
Yeah,
human to
I
human.
I
But
agree.
I think, again, if you're thinking empathy is doing what the other person wants,
Mm,
you might say, yeah, you need to dial that back a lot.
mm,
But
mm,
but there might be times where you do need to sort of exert your power a little bit and say, like, I am setting a precedent here. And I understand this is not, exactly what you would like, but this is what we're doing. This is the decision we're making as a company. This is the decision we're making as a business. It's funny because I argue both sides of the return to office
yes. Mm,
scenario. On the one hand, I do not believe that innovation and creativity and collaboration can only happen within four walls. We proved it during the pandemic, and we opened up the talent pool to a lot of different people that did not function at their best in an office environment.
mm,
Or we were able to get the best talent no matter where they were or what their family situation or anything like that, disabilities, anything.
mm,
However, if you as a company make a business decision to say, yes, we're going to say that everyone has to come back to the office. Yes, that could initially be looked at as very unempathetic.
mm,
In some cases, the motives behind it are based on fear
of
and
course.
mistrust. They're
Mm,
not based on. But I also, as a leader and as a company, have the right to run my business how we want to run it in order for us to meet our objectives. And at that point, being clear about it is actually very empathetic because then I, as a worker, I, as an employee, where I'm able to, I know this is not the true for everyone, not everyone
mm,
has this privilege, but now I have to have some agency and say, is this place no longer serving my needs? Is this place no longer aligning with my values? Instead of kicking and screaming against the company making the decision they need to make to keep the business sustainable in their
mm,
view,
mm,
it's not all about the employee changing the company and saying, you're horrible because you're making us all go back to the office. They're making it clear, if at least if they are supporting you and doing the things from an empathy
mm,
standpoint to make it as easy as possible for
mm.
people to accommodate that. At some point, we as employees have to have agency and say, it's not about us changing everyone else. I need to understand that maybe this is not the place for me anymore.
Yeah.
So I kind of see it. I see
Mm,
both sides of it.
yeah. Mm,
Where I take umbrage is the blanket return to office,
yes.
just because
Yeah.
leaders don't want to concern themselves with how to manage in a hybrid environment.
Too difficult.
It's
Yeah.
too hard. I need to see everybody. I don't know if they're working, right?
Yeah.
Those
Well,
are not the best. Those are not the
no,
best reasons to go,
no.
return to office.
That sentence in
So
itself.
yeah, yeah. But but
Mm,
I but I always like to remind, it's empathy flows both ways. And it's
yeah.
not just the leader's job or the organization's job to show empathy. Employees, even like maybe younger ones that are not used to it, maybe they came into the workforce where all these accommodations were of
Mm,
everyday practice in the last few years.
mm,
They also need to be empathetic to their leaders and the stress and the challenges that they're under
mm,
and try to say, well, what can I do to make things easier for my leader and for my team? It's
mm.
not all just about me.
No, and I think that's why I love the first four pillars, well, all five of them, but particularly the first four, which are for me working on making personal agency explicit. So
Hmm.
you start with self-awareness, you have self-care for understanding how to resource yourself, and then clarity, of course, and decisiveness. One can always take a decision. One always has personal agency to take one's own decision,
Hmm.
irrespective of what's happening in the organization. Like you said, maybe I decide this isn't the place for me. Maybe I decide maybe I'd like to do that. I'm going to have a different conversation.
Right.
Which, and this personal agency, which it's too easy to say, oh, the system won't let me. Oh, my boss won't let me. Oh, we don't do that
Hmm.
around here like that. It's like, and so
Hmm.
why don't you suggest that you may or you could? Which brings me to your final pillar of joy, which
Hmm.
is music to my ears around joy and playfulness in the workplace, because particularly when it gets tough and in today's world, I think it's really, really important. And of course, if you build enough personal agency, you can bring that joy, can't you? In
Yeah.
any people are a little bit scared of the word joy, I think, because it sounds big and fluffy like empathy or,
Hmm.
or inclusion or
Yeah.
but I think, if I love the anecdote in the book around canned fish Mondays. And I mean, if you could just walk us through that and other, the very
Yeah.
small ways of having a lot of impact in terms of how joyful a workplace or a meeting
Yeah.
environment can be.
Yeah. Before we do that, can I just make one point that I forgot to make about the
Yeah,
decisiveness pillar? And that is where the decisiveness pillar goes wrong. I was saying people don't
yeah,
want to be in limbo. You need
yeah.
to make decisions. However, this is not a license to be a dictator and to
Yes.
make decisions in a closed room.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the art of the decisiveness pillar is how can I solicit multiple points of view and synthesize them swiftly in
mm,
order to make a decision and to understand that no decision exists that will please everyone on the team.
yeah,
Because if I wait to make that decision, if I wait to have the difficult conversation when someone's not having a hard time,
mm,
if I, decisiveness is about considering the other viewpoints and synthesizing those multiple viewpoints, which has to do with the joy pillar, as we're going to
yeah,
talk about in a
yeah,
second. But then swiftly understanding, like, I'm going to make a call by Tuesday,
yeah,
or I'm going to block it on my calendar that this is the day I have to make this decision. Because when you drag out decisions,
yeah,
again, all that fear and anxiety, people know what's going on.
of course.
And so the more you can solicit input, make the decision, and then with empathy, communicate the decision back to the team in a way that still encourages future feedback.
Yeah,
So, here's why I made this decision. I'm being transparent about it.
mm,
Considered all your ideas. And Susie, you had a really great idea about X. Here's why we weren't able to implement that. But please keep
yeah,
those ideas coming.
mm,
We always want you to,
mm,
so I encourage you to
yeah,
continue to give feedback in the
mm.
future.
And you've
But
listened
where
to me and you've heard
and I've
me and
listened to
yeah.
you, and now
Mm.
you're like, okay, I don't love it, but at least I know it was
Okay.
considered. Yeah.
Yeah.
But kind of related to joy on that is, I almost didn't put the joy pillar in. I almost just had
Oh,
four
I'm glad you
pillars,
did.
but I know because I was like, that was another common thread that I
Yeah.
saw was, and we don't mean constant laughter
No.
because work is hard and work doesn't need to be blissful every second of every day. But where can you bring levity to the work even when it gets hard?
Mm.
And that's where I saw these really empathetic yet effective and high performing leaders making room for levity, making room for joy, and not putting the pressure on themselves that I've got to figure out how to put more joy into this
Yeah.
team all by myself, right? But I'm not funny, but
Cognitively.
I'm not fun, or whatever. But leveraging, kind of going back to that decisiveness and
Yeah.
leveraging input, leverage input from the team. Let the team organically find ways to inject joy
Mm.
and levity. The canned fish
Monday.
days was from Canned Fish Mondays was from, something, a leader I spoke to during the pandemic, during lockdown. Two of the leaders happened to notice they were both having like sardines in their house or something for lunch, and they decided to implement it as a thing for the whole team of like, okay, if whoever wants to get involved, we're doing canned fish Mondays, right? So let us know what you're having for lunch. Other teams did really creative things like Slack channels devoted to like, where's your first post-lockdown vacation going to be and
Yeah.
why?
Yeah.
Or what are take an artistic picture of what you made for lunch at home today.
Mm.
um, Being able to have those moments before you start a meeting and get down to business
Yeah.
of, how was everyone's weekend? Where are we today? Let's level set. Let's come into the meeting,
Mm.
not like drop in like a bomb, but
Yeah.
let's ease into the meeting and ease into the work
Mm.
by getting to know each other a little bit
Mm.
better.
Mm.
Teams did, wine tastings over Zoom. Teams did, my husband's team did succulent garden building together one
Wow.
time. And it seems fluffy and it seems like a waste, But when you build that camaraderie with people, they
Absolutely.
are more willing to be empathetic with each other, but they
Yeah.
also collaborate better because
Yeah.
now there's a level of trust, there's a level of resilience, there's a level of like, I'm putting my guard down and I get to know you as a person and not just, a coworker that I
Mm.
need stuff from.
It's collective resilience, isn't it? They're building a sort of a
Yes.
space of resilience. And for me, I often get that question, how do you scale empathy? Which is why I like your framework as well. Um, but and time is running, but I can't ask you about empathy without asking you about the future of work and AI. And because it's on everybody's
Yeah,
mind,
I know.
what are your thoughts on this intersection between empathy and AI, and whether one day will AI or generative AI or whatever it is AI then
Hmm.
replace humans in this domain?
Well, it's interesting because I'm not an AI expert, but I've spoken
Mm,
to a lot of them on my podcast on the
mm,
Empathy Edge and gained really valuable perspectives on this. So, with the advent of AI, we're hopefully automating a lot of the tasks that are tasks we don't necessarily need our human skills for.
yeah,
So, having those human skills, leaders won't be able to hide behind the busy work anymore
no,
with AI. So
yeah,
they are going to have to build their human skills because those are the skills of leading, of active listening, of curiosity, of support that AI will not be able to replicate.
mm,
So your value as a leader will go up exponentially if you
mm,
build your emotional intelligence, your empathy, your ability to
mm,
engage in psychological safety.
mm,
You will be more valuable as a leader
mm,
because AI is going to automate a lot of the things that maybe you hang your hat on now.
yeah,
The other thing is there is this whole field of AI called empathic AI, and I spoke to a founder of a company that's doing that, where they're trying to replicate in industries and fields where resources are short, where counseling is needed, where support is needed, where people need to make some decisions, or even like loneliness and
yeah,
companionship.
yeah,
They're creating AI systems that are not so much like the typical learning language models that predict patterns,
yeah,
but they're AI models that look for anomalies. So they start to recognize tone. They start
wow,
to
yeah,
recognize how you're phrasing your question so that but again, all of this, what I loved about talking to her, she's like, but who's programming these? We
yeah,
need humans that have the skills to put these
mm,
programs into place.
mm,
And there's always going to be a point where human intervention is
necessary,
required.
yeah,
And so there's really that balance of the human AI connection of blending those things so that we are exponentially more effective and more efficient. But
mm,
the human element can't go away because AI makes too many mistakes. There's too
mm,
many nuances to human nature and human behavior. You're always going to need to have a human either programming that or coding that or augmenting that
mm,
work for people. But in a lot of fields, there's a lot of great strides where, like in higher ed, where you're
yeah,
advising students on
yeah,
career paths or curriculum programs. That's a way to sort of get to what do they want, what do they need, what are they actually asking for. I'm going to customize this for you
mm,
as Susie to say,
mm,
based on what you're telling me, I think these might be some good options for you.
mm,
That replicates a guidance counselor that maybe that institution doesn't have enough of.
yes,
So it could be a good thing, but we will always need those humans
mm,
to create those models and to program that into the solutions. We
mm.
can't replicate human connection.
No, absolutely not. And it's part of the answer to a lack of resource, isn't it? Because it will give clarity to come back to some people in a way
Hmm.
that's considerate, or that considers as much information as it has on those people or on that situation.
Hmm.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, and I think, I completely agree with this, it's up to us to understand, I'm coming back to a self-awareness discussion, to understand how we work, humans,
Hmm. Hmm.
individuals, but also collectively, and how we can leverage that. The more time is created for us by automation of tasks that we don't need to do, or that somebody, machines or AI can do.
Hmm. Exactly.
Wow. Yeah. So, well, in one way, it's comforting. I don't think you can replace human connection. I think COVID showed us
Hmm.
that. You
Hmm.
can you can create middle grounds. You can,
Hmm.
make sure that people are connected somehow. But I don't think anything really
Hmm.
can step into or replace human connections, which
Hmm.
of course is
Hmm.
based on empathy. Maria,
Hmm.
time is running. Can I ask you one last question?
Yes.
What is the most transformative thing you've ever done? Because you've written lots of books, you've had lots of impact, you're on a constant learning journey with your podcast, your research, and everything else. If you had to pick just one thing, because like you say, we're learning all the time, what do you
Right.
think is the most transformative thing you've ever done or learned?
Oh my goodness. This is going to be not work related, but if I would have said more than 10 years ago, I would have said starting my own business was
Yeah,
one of the most transformative, and you have to hold a mirror to your own challenges and your
yeah,
own strengths,
yeah.
and you really test your own resilience. But then I had a child,
Yeah, I guess.
and I have to say that
Yeah.
parenting is
Mm.
the most transformative thing I've done, and not in a Pollyanna, it's all light
Oh,
and
yes.
sweetness all the time,
Mm.
but really having to understand yourself, kind of going back to that self-awareness.
Yes. Yeah.
So much of this applies to parenting, by the way.
Absolutely. I was just thinking
Understanding your
that.
own strengths and your
Yeah.
own challenges and my own emotional triggers, and constantly looking at my behavior and how I model the
Mm.
things that I think are important to teach my son. It's humbling. It's really humbling. And it's something where you're like, this is where I could be doing a better job.
Mm.
And it just
Mm.
smacks you in the face.
Yeah.
So I would have to say parenting is the most transformative thing I've ever done. And I'm continuing to try
Yeah.
to perfect it, but no one ever does. And I'm constantly learning about
Mm.
myself and having wins and having knockdowns on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I think the empathy dilemma is about being human. That's the human condition. You know,
Totally,
it's
totally.
ups and downs, it's learning, it's failing, it's getting back up, it's doing things differently.
Hmm.
Maria, if you had a final call to action for our listeners, therefore, what would it be?
It would be to recognize that empathy is your strength and not a weakness. It actually requires great strength to be empathetic, to see someone else's point of view without that defensiveness and fear that we spoke about. And so, if you are highly empathic, just make sure that you are taking care of yourself and that you are setting your boundaries
Mm.
to still enable you to be empathetic. And if you feel like you're not so empathetic, take comfort in the fact that we as humans are all born with empathy. It's just a muscle that might have atrophied for you. And the good news is that that muscle, like any other muscle, can be strengthened with practice.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm going to leave our listeners with that of either setting boundaries or going to the gym. I'm going to put it like that.
I like that summary. Yeah.
Maria, thank you so much for coming and sharing your research and what's in your book and your opinion on empathy. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, I think the easiest place is that they can go to theempathydilemma.com, which is a page, it's a redirect to a page on my website. They can go there and they can download a free chapter of the book, but they will also be on my website. So they can take a look at my speaking, at my services. They can sign up for my newsletter to get insights and inspirations direct to their inbox every month. And I'm on social as well, LinkedIn.
Okay.
Just send me a note that says you heard me on this podcast if
Okay.
you're going to connect with me. And I'm on Instagram at Red Slice Maria.
Excellent. I'll put all those in the show notes so that people can find you easily and yeah, read the empathy dilemma and decide what you think. That would be my call to action for my listeners. Thank you, Maria. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you so much.